Hello everyone and welcome again to the Digital Signage Guide. Today we're going to be looking at something that's really close to our heart. We've talked about it several times in different videos, but I really wanted to focus in on something that we work on a lot, and that is enterprise and scale. And what we wanted to focus on today is some of the core functions within Signage Live that allows you to scale your digital signage. And what do we mean by scale? Well, sometimes you're only looking at displaying one or two screens, and really it's almost a one-to-one relationship with any content that you're building versus the content that you're then delivering to the screens. Where it starts getting more complicated and where we have most of our conversations kind of longer term with bigger clients and customers is, how do we do this at a bigger volume? What if I have several people that need to manage the content? And what if I have several players or devices that I want to distribute over multiple locations? What do we need to consider before we get to that point? So we're going to take you through four main things to consider when looking at enterprise digital signage. The first of which is, who's going to be responsible for your hardware? You may be in a position in the company where you're being tasked to go and find the right CMS solution, the right hardware, the right content, the right structure to deliver a digital signage project across your entire company. Then one of the questions needs to be, well, who's actually responsible for the hardware once it's installed? There's a couple of different options there. You can look at hiring or having a third party be responsible for that, like an AV integrator or a reseller, or you could take part responsibility for making sure those players are up and running. One of the things within Signage Live is being able to manage your network at scale, making sure that all the players are configured to run in the way that you want them to run, being able to make sure that those players are checking in and making sure they have the most up-to-date content. But there's always situations where, let's say, power goes out on location or the internet's down. Being able to validate that by a user on location who's responsible for that is something that you should consider, especially if you're looking at your IT team. It's probably worth sitting down with them to understand and discuss the technical requirements, like any firewalls that may need to be considered before starting with this. The second one is, who's actually responsible for your content? Often this is overlooked, which is crazy because it is one of the most important pieces. Once you've got the screen up on the wall, once it's been plugged in and installed, who's managing that bit on the screen? Well, that can be several different people. It could be a marketing team or a department that's dedicated to managing content internally specifically. Or what you could actually do is say, well, we, from a head office perspective, we want to be able to go and manage this, but we don't really want to do all the heavy lifting of the content. Our previous email was actually about having free content from the marketplace, so things like calendar and weather and clocks that you don't actively need to be engaged with. But there's always going to be some element on this screen that you've created yourself and you want to distribute. That could be yourself, or what we've seen with other examples, actually a particular company that had 600, 700 players. They've actually given the keys to the content management to individualized groups across all of those departments. So each location has their own responsibility to go and update their content. Now, from a head office perspective or from a kind of top level, they can still see how everything is running, but they're not tasked with the day-to-day updates of the content or week-to-week or whatever that might be. That's done by a team responsible. So being able to understand who is responsible for your content in the company, and then actually taking them on board as early as possible to display the CMS platform that you're choosing and make sure that it has the features and you have the features that they'd actually like to see on the screen. So that's another really important one that's definitely worth considering, and making sure that that team is invited into the conversation as early as possible, because they're going to be the ones that require training. They're going to be the ones that need to understand the platform and its benefits and the functionality at its core. So the next one that we're going to be looking at is content structure. Now that you've got your content team in place, it's worth sitting down with them and actually outlining the way that you'd like to distribute this content. Are these screens predominantly full screen, or are they going to be zoned content, as in the top left-hand corner here? And if so, who's responsible for each zone and where does the variable happen? It could be that this zone here is dedicated to a global communication, whereas the right-hand side is more localized or regionalized based on the location of where that player is. Understanding what you want to pull from this is going to make your life easier when it comes to the content management. The simpler, the better. Now, you can get to the point where you have something like this running across hundreds of different devices, and there's a lot of variables in there using the tag functionality, using localized playlists or nested playlists. But the question has to be asked first is that something you require? If it is, great, build the infrastructure to match. If it isn't, then you can skip that piece. And actually it makes the content management much easier because your individual users just know what they need to manage. Doesn't mean that getting to this point of complexity makes the training any harder. For example, if we had this situation where this screen is being showed to 700 different locations, and this zone here on the right-hand side is only showing in the Australian-based players, for example, And the local user who's in Australia can manage this content. Their experience is very, very simple. They don't need to manage any of the network. They don't need to understand the reporting or anything like that. They simply just need to know that the playlist that they can affect has been configured to only display on that bottom right-hand corner. And that's where understanding your content structure earlier will help you, because rather than having to learn on the go, giving yourself a plan or an idea, an outline of where that content is going to go in the end is going to make things much, much easier. The fourth one to cover here is hardware rollout. Now, when you're going to roll out a large volume of players, there's some things to consider. I mean, there's the basic capabilities of how do we get this screen on the wall? Are we looking at system on chip versus an on-screen device? Is there a combination of the two? You'll most likely work with your AV integrator or your reseller to come up with a formalized plan, but you're also going to need someone on site who's going to be able to sign off on this, make sure that the work is done, make sure that it's installed and plan dates and all of the kind of more technical jargon that comes with planning out the specific rollout. Understanding who's going to be responsible for receiving the hardware or managing the installation that happens on site is going to be quite a large project, because you're going to need to make sure that all of your staff are available on the dates, the resellers understand the dates for delivery and when those screens are going to turn up, or the players or whatever it might be that you've ordered, and then how the installation happens. Whether or not you are installing the screens yourself, it might be that you've opted to have that done by someone on site. You may have someone who's responsible for that on site and will do that for you. But in the initial instance, these are the four main elements to consider. So you've got your hardware rollout. How are we going to put these screens up and running? Who's responsible for the hardware once it's installed? Is that an IT team? Is it dedicated per location? Who's going to be managing the content? Who's uploading this content? Who's planning where it should be delivered and how it should be delivered? And then finally, what is that structure going to look like with the content? These are the questions that we get when we look at these larger customers and how they want to deliver their digital signage. There's a lot more to consider around that. So some of the things that I do want to mention in terms of enterprise and the tools that are built there for you is things like granular user permissions. With granular user permissions, you can create your individual roles. In fact, I can hop over to our UI here. So with granular user permissions, a functionality that we've built into the platform, this is going to help you scale with your users. So first of all, if I go to the settings and users tab here, you can actually see we've got all of the users on our platform. If I go to my settings and roles, you can actually see all of the roles that we've built into the platform already. What this will allow you to do is create your own role. Do you want them to be able to go and see reporting? Should they be able to only affect playlists but not layouts? Do you want them to publish content, or do you just want them to manage the playlist that they have? All of this can be configured with over 250 different variables, and that gives you the power to A, simplify training for those users, so you don't need to train them on things that they could accidentally be clicking on and really isn't relevant to them. And B, it also simplifies your management of these user profiles. With the ability to go into our users here, I can create something called a user group. And a user group is a host of users that have the same level of privilege. So for example, I've created a Creator Plus group here, and these users I've built that only manage content. So they don't need to see the settings or the dashboard or the reporting. I just want them to be able to log in, find the playlists, make changes, and hit save. So I've created that user group, and the users live in there already. I can just add new users in here and they automatically pick up on the same privilege. So when we're looking at managing 600 users or 100 users, whatever it might be, it's not a one-by-one relationship. It's a group or a cluster of users with that functionality. A couple of other things that we've added, especially from enterprise level, which is often important, is things like Active Directory and two-factor authentication. With Active Directory, you can manage your user access via your preferred Active Directory, such as Azure or OneLogin, and there's a whole host of other ones that you can look at there as well. And with two-factor authentication, you can choose, if I go to my roles, for example, I can choose whether my role requires two-factor authentication or not. You might make this network-wide. Everyone within the platform requires two-factor authentication to access that platform, as well as your Active Directory. So it's one or the other, typically, because you'll most likely have two-factor authentication enabled on your Active Directory, but it depends on what level of control that you want to give them. So in between all of these functions, and we've talked about tags, and there's a lot more capabilities in the platform that we've built specifically for enterprise, but that just gives you a flavor of some of the things to consider when looking at your enterprise network. If you've got any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Otherwise, we'll see you on the next one. And again, thank you very much.